Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Yasmin bin Humam. I'm the co-facilitator of the Women's Financial Inclusion Community of Practice, and this is the third webinar in our series from our Data and Measurement Working Group on insights in sex disaggregated data on financial inclusion. A few housekeeping notes. All attendees have been muted upon entry. Please send your questions and comments through the chat box. You'll see in the drop-down that you can send them to the host and presenters. Please select that option. I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation in that chat box. So please do send your questions for the speaker, and we hope to leave about half an hour for Q&A so that we can get to what you want to know. If you are the tweeting kind, please feel free to tweet and use the hashtag WFI COP for Women's Financial Inclusion Community of Practice. With me is Nadia Vandewala, Senior Research Manager at Intermedia, where she manages financial inclusion and consumer insights research. As part of this role, she focuses on better understanding users' decision-making and experiences. So for those of you with questions, comments, demands, you're definitely, you have the right person here, and you have her ear and full attention. She also helps to design new initiatives and produce market-level analysis. We're hoping that you'll come away with, from this webinar with some deeper insights into what you can do with the Financial Inclusion Insights data, particularly on what you can do with its data on women's financial inclusion, and some ideas perhaps for new questions, new initiatives, new partnerships. With that, I will now hand over the mic to Nadia, which will take just a moment, and she will take it away for us.
Thank you, Yasmin. So as Yasmin said, my name is Nadia Vandewal. I am with Intermedia, an economic research firm based in Washington with an office in Nairobi, and I manage our financial services research practice area with a focus on financial sector development. This includes the Financial Inclusion Insights program that I'll be talking to you about today. So thank you all for joining, and I look forward to getting started. This is the general agenda for today. We'll be introducing FII. We'll talk a little bit about how you can use FII data and some examples of the gender analysis that can be done with FII data. We'll give some examples from our own research tied to Kenya in 2017 of gender research we've gotten started on. And time allowing, we'll do a demonstration of how to access the FII data. Finally, we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. And I will be sharing, we'll happily share the PowerPoint slides following the presentation. So please know that as we're going through. So first of all, what is Financial Inclusion Insights? It's a program that started about 5 years ago with funding from the Gates Foundation. The idea is really to measure the client experience or demand-side data and get to understand non-users just as well as users of financial services in 8 key countries: Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Kenya, Nigeria, Pakistan, Tanzania, and Uganda. We both look at questions such as access, usage, demand, user preferences for all kinds of financial services ranging from informal to digital to non-bank financial institutions such as MFIs. But we also look at questions of some of the drivers and barriers that are hindering or supporting adoption. So things like mobile phone ownership, internet usage, experiences with new products with agents. And because we collect data around nationally representative subsamples, we can look at underserved groups a bit more closely, such as women, the poor, and rural populations. We update the survey instrument each year to account for new interests of key stakeholders. So for example, we may add client protection issues that are at the forefront of industry discussions, things around the performance of mobile money agents, or experience with new products such as mobile credit. And we do customize the survey somewhat for each country. So while there is a core instrument being undertaken throughout those 8 countries that leads to comparisons, there are some tweaks. So for example, we may add some questions on specific welfare payments to women for the Pakistan module, or for specific digital products in Kenya that do not exist elsewhere. You may be wondering, given the increasing amount of data in financial inclusion, how the Financial Inclusion Insights datasets compare to other data resources. So first of all, this is a demand-side data source. So you may know some of the supply-side sources coming out from GSMA or specific providers, or reported by telecoms authorities based on provider reports, but this is user-reported. We're going directly to national populations in these countries. So that's one big difference. Compared to some of the other demand-side data surveys, it is done at the individual level. So we are asking specific, our base unit is adults in each country that are 15 years and older rather than households. And that's important in that we can, as a result, focus on the female experience and look at market segments based on age, as well as some of the subnational groups, such as location. Then it is collected annually, which makes a big difference, because as the climate evolves very quickly in many of these countries, specifically with regards to mobile money uptake or digital financial services, or as major events such as demonetization occur, we can get at sort of what impact that had from year to year. Some of the other kind of unique factors are just the sheer size of the survey, as indicated in the graph to the left. As an example from our survey in 2015, we are interviewing as many as 45,000 people in some countries and 3,000 in smaller countries. There is a bit more of a focus on digital financial services than some of the other surveys. We do really get at things like phone ownership, phone access, phone sharing, and uptake of digital services. And then lastly, one of the things that we have really strived for in our survey is to include welfare measures based on the Grameen Progress Out of Poverty Index. This is unique to FII, and it helps us segment populations based on income level and really analyze the impact of their poverty and some of the experiences they have as a result, using this household consumption survey module for purposes of this data. Another key difference that sometimes goes understood in this sector is definitions. And I'm including on this slide just an example of some of the definitions that are covered in our glossary for some of the key terms we're collecting information on. And the reason that I flag this is because one of the most common questions that we get will be, why, for instance, are your numbers a little bit different than some of the ones I'm seeing reported elsewhere? And the biggest example of this might be the level of financial inclusion in a specific country. And so I really want to stress that it's important to always go back to how those terms are being defined in the survey. And for example, we count financial inclusion as the number of individuals who hold an account in their name with a full-service financial institution. So if you really break that down to how we're measuring it, it is the percentage of adults in a country who are 15 years and older, again, who have a registered account in their name with a formal institution, so one that comes under government supervision and offers a full suite of financial services. This means that we wouldn't count a person who's using someone else's account. We wouldn't count informal services such as savings collectors or money guards. And we wouldn't count a credit-only MFI. And again, I flag that because it's one of the most common questions we get, such as why is the woman's financial inclusion in this country that you're measuring lower than the one in this government's reported numbers for their financial inclusion strategy? And sometimes it reflects both this definition as well as things like, well, we are counting the percentage at the individual level, not the household level. FII produces a series of reports. So each year we produce an annual report for each country as well as sort of a summary report. We also do qualitative follow-up studies in each country. So for example, we might look at the experiences with financial services of displaced populations in a specific country. We also have done some cross-country gender reporting. In 2015, there's a report up on our website. Or for example, we'll do national surveys in other countries that are outside of the FII 8 countries using a similar methodology. So we did reports in Ghana and Rwanda. And again, you can find women's data specifically in those reports. So that's some background on FII. In terms of accessing the data and using it, it's important first to flag that your use is very important to us. A big mandate of the program is to be creating a public data system and to be supporting program design, product design, initiatives, policymaking of stakeholders. And so, for instance, we know that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, their partners, researchers, NGOs, many actors are using the data. We track their use based on what they're telling us, and we try to update the survey instrument year to year to reflect their needs. So I say that just to encourage engagement and feedback on the instrument to the extent that you're willing to give it. You can access the data in two ways. The first one is for those of you who are more comfortable with extensive data sets, working in programs such as SPSS and Stata, doing calculations and graphs in Excel. You can reach out to this email address to request the full data set for all years, all countries, so that's 5 years, 8 countries, all variables, and you would receive the code books and the questionnaires as well. For those of you who are more new to data analysis and more comfortable with basic queries, you can go to this website link and you'll have access to data for all years, all countries, but it's only some of the variables. So compared to the thousands of variables that we collect, this is a condensed set of 60 key indicators that are derived based on the rest of the data, and it includes things like access, registration, advanced use, dormancy, for specific products and specific populations, but it's simply a bit more user-friendly. All data is free. Some examples of how others are using the FII data are listed on this slide, but I want to get into the meat of the presentation, so I'll just circulate this afterwards. But again, it's often to support policymaking, program design, and product design. So in terms of what FII can tell you about women, I went through the survey and I created this slide based on that. First and foremost, because it's a survey about financial behaviors and experience with financial services, we can really get at and segment for women specifically their experience with lending, with saving, with insurance, with investments, their use of different kinds of services such as informal services and cash, and kind of their progress along the customer journey. So from year to year, how is women's levels of advanced use, more advanced products, over-the-counter services, or maybe dormancy changing in each country. Additionally, and this is what we'll be focusing on in the next few slides, we do collect information on empowerment, so things like intra-household decision-making, autonomy, variation in asset control, bargaining and influence, asset accumulation, and economic security. A newer module that we've added in the last 2 years relates to financial health, as this topic has grown in interest. So we look at things like earnings and savings retention, experience with shocks, resilience, and ability to plan and save. And you could, again, look at this specifically for women. And then we look at sort of barriers or levers for financial inclusion. So what are people's education levels? What kind of digital and financial literacy do they have? We added a module on financial numeracy today based on some, sorry, not today, this year, based on some of the work done by My Oral Village. We've added information on KYC enablers, such as the kinds of IDs people own, the kinds of phones they have, to what extent they're sharing phones and with who, proximity in terms of physical distance to financial services, many questions on awareness of products and services, as well as network strength, mobile phone use, and proficiency. And All of this information is collected for the population as a whole, so that means that you could also not only segment by demographics, but look at specific groups such as active registered users as well as non-users. And in some countries, that group of non-users is quite significant. So in Pakistan, for example, it's much larger than in Kenya, where the financial inclusion numbers are quite big. An example of sort of a common way that we'll break down the data for women is looking at, when it comes to financial behaviors, is looking at customer journey and seeing how along different stages of engagement with financial services, a woman's financial health, or as we're hoping to do in the coming months, level of economic empowerment changes. So to the extent that financial engagement is a spectrum, starting with meeting certain preconditions or not being a user, but being somebody who has an ID or has a phone, getting all the way to the point of being an advanced active user, we can look at how women are progressing compared to men, where they sort of get stuck, what those barriers are, how their financial health changes, and we can run some analysis for how economic empowerment and other empowerment factors play into that. But specifically focusing on empowerment. So in 2017, after 4 years of prior survey collection, based on discussions with some of our partners, including Gates and the International Center for Research on Women, we added a module on economic empowerment. And based on our review and others' review of the literature, we sort of understood this to break down across categories such as the ability to avoid and negotiate negative consequences, women's entering of the labor market, their control over time, their ability to earn an income, acquire assets, hold savings, and to what extent they had autonomy or power in household bargaining. And we tried to think through how we could get at questions that would ask about those things and how they would tie to financial inclusion. So some examples of what we came up with were, to the extent that productivity loss happens for a woman just based on the time, money, energy she's spending getting to be able to use a financial product or service. So maybe her long bus ride to the MFI she uses, or waiting in line at the bank. We also thought through how access to capital or other sort of labor-saving devices could help in terms of productive activities. And then we thought that it was really important to consider participation in the labor market to the extent that often simply having wages paid into an account can be a first step towards financial inclusion. So these were some of the things that we were thinking about when we thought about economic empowerment, and being able to sort of measure some of these factors, analyze them, and get at the heart of financial decision-making for women. With that in mind, we evolved our gender module along several lines. So to begin, when we first were collecting data in 2013, we were collecting financial behaviors, and then in our analysis, because we were collecting it for men and women, we could disaggregate based on gender. So we could see, for example, that women had lower levels of access to phones, and this was affecting their financial inclusion levels to some extent. But as we decided to add a gender module based on discussions with the Gates Financial Services for the Poor Gender team and the International Center for Research on Women, we realized that it would be really important to introduce some questions in addition to these behavioral insights. And we looked at the body of research and saw that there was more and more being done in terms of empowerment that focused on decision making. And so we added indicators related to empowerment, final decisions in households. So how much power or bargaining do you have when it comes to those decisions? Earnings and savings retention, and measuring the resources and financial health of women. So for example, we started to see that in Bangladesh, women were less likely to be able to decide what kind of financial services they used, and spouses tended to make this decision for them. Or we started getting at the heart of kind of the autonomy of financial lives based on women acquiring assets. We got some really helpful feedback from the International Center for Research on Women that helped us expand the gender module to better measure economic empowerment. And here there were a few things they suggested, which were sort of interesting lessons for just gender data collection as a whole. So first, the way that you ask questions, especially in different cultures, matters. Making people feel uncomfortable can impact the data. Also, there's a lot of variation to asset control. So maybe a woman had more say over basic household needs, payments, savings decisions, financial decisions, but the man had decision-making power over more complex needs or long-term saving. Additionally, when we really dug into intra-household borrowing, we saw that we needed to look beyond the spouse and also think about in-laws, co-wives, other sort of unique dynamics to polygamous cultures, et cetera. And we also needed to get beyond simply the autonomy of a woman, so yes or no does she make decisions, but really look at the bargaining process and to what extent she had influence and could sort of play a role in decision making. So that's how we've updated the module. All of our data for 2017 is in, and we'll be analyzing it over the next couple of months and seeing how this module tested out, and we'll probably be making some tweaks and changes for coming years. And we'll see how this continues to evolve for 2018. But it's been fascinating, and we really look forward to feedback as the data comes in as well for how this all tested. So here's an example of our 16 gender empowerment indicators. We do ask these questions of all participants to the surveys, so men and women, and they generally look at questions of agency, empowerment, asset accumulation, and economic security. I know this is small and difficult to read, but we'll be sending it. And I'll get back to why 9.1 is in bold. So some of our future areas of interest to explore as the data comes in reflect some of the topics identified in a recent report that I encourage everyone to check out from the International Center for Research on Women called Gender and Digital Financial Inclusion, What Do We Know and What Do We Need to Know? So we're curious on looking at the impact of time use. We're interested in doing comparison across countries. We hope to look at specific age groups, the negative impacts maybe of digital financial inclusion, and also connect financial inclusion to financial health, such as poverty, resilience, and economic shocks, among other topics. Now, I wanted to show an example of some of the initial research we've done on Kenya as the Kenya 2017 data using this new gender module has come in. This is really just a taste and really just reflects, a few days of work as the data has come in quite recently. But hopefully it can show you sort of what you might be able to do and give you a sense of what we hope to do in the coming months now that the data's in. And so, again, just based on some of the behavioral insights we've collected for the last 5 years, we can look at something as simple as the gender gap, especially in this unique market, which is more sophisticated in some ways and has had much more of an advanced and deeper engagement with financial inclusion. If you look at these two graphs, they basically show the gap between the percentage of men and the percentage of women who are financially included and how it's changed over 5 years. And as you can see, the orange line represents all men, all women in Kenya, and it's gone up. A higher percentage of men than women is increasingly widening while reporting some kind of uneven results from year to year. This is particularly true for all men, for all women. It's a little lower for rural men versus rural women, and it's a little lower for poor men versus poor women, which is interesting. The other gap that's growing is the difference between active digital financial service users. But interestingly, it's not quite as big, again, for rural men, rural women. And we think this gap is important to kind of keep track of and keep looking at the barriers and levers in different countries as time goes on. And I will say when we've looked at this gap elsewhere, such as in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and India, it's quite different. It's quite large. So Kenya was just our example here because all the data was in. Another interesting thing to look at, as I mentioned, when we added the gender module, we added information on intra-household decision making. And here what we looked at was how did women answer questions versus men when it came to their power or perceptions of household influence. So what you see are several categories that we asked them about. And everything that's to the right of the line represents when men had a significant greater percentage than women in answering the question, and everything to the left represents where women had a greater power. So to kind of break that down, when we asked them, you know, do you have most or almost all the influence in final decisions about income spending, 6% more men than women said that they did. When we asked them, do you contribute most or almost all of household income per month, perhaps unsurprisingly, a much greater percentage of men than women said that they did. On the other hand, when we asked, how involved are you in deciding how household income is spent on basic needs, we saw that women tended to have a greater percentage of control over basic needs. But when we asked about who held the most influence on final decisions about income spending, we saw that women were much more likely to say their spouse held that influence. So again, this is just kind of a taste of some of the initial analysis that we've done when we focus on some of the gender questions tied to household influence. But the big takeaway is, perhaps unsurprisingly, that men tend to make more of the decisions. And so an interesting question that we were left with was, how might financial inclusion impact this level of autonomy and household influence? And that's sort of what we're starting to dive into now and hoping to look at for each country. So to do that, we looked back at those 16 gender variables that I highlighted earlier. And we decided to focus for now, given the limited time between the data coming in this presentation, on 5 variables that we thought reflected more the topic of empowerment. And we analyzed these for a gender effect. These variables tended to reflect household decision-making with a focus on different spending categories and autonomy. And interestingly, we saw that the strongest gender effect, so the one where being a woman hurt you the most, was the variable for how involved are you in deciding what kind of financial services you use. Men were 24% more likely to say that they were highly involved than women. But when we introduced financial inclusion, the gender effect became insignificant. So in other words, being financially included obviously, perhaps unsurprisingly, meant that women had more control and decision-making of household financial services. But it did raise some circularity arguments, and that's kind of what we want to dive into in the coming weeks. On the other hand, what was interesting, and again, we don't know if this is unique for Kenya, was that there was no significant effect of gender on any of the other empowerment variables that we looked at. But financial inclusion did highly increase the odds of empowerment across all indicators, whether or not you were a woman. So our conclusion was that for Kenya, at least, based on these variables we looked at, and we look forward to diving in more and looking at all 16, financial inclusion was actually a much stronger determinant of autonomous decision-making than gender was. So I say that, but of course we do want to stress the analysis is ongoing, and we'll be diving in more over the next couple of weeks, but just kind of an interesting breakdown for Kenya. So I'll take maybe 5 minutes to just do a demonstration of how you can access the data using our basic tool if you don't want to request the full data set, and then we'll turn to Q&A. So if you want to access the full data set, my colleague who will help you through that is named Reedy. But essentially, you would go to our webpage and type in inclusion.org/datafinder. You scroll to the bottom of the page where you see a link that says, if your research needs go beyond the data tools function, please contact Intermedia, and you would click on that. That then takes you to a form where we ask that you fill in some basic questions about your background and potentially your use of the data. And you'll hear it in about 3 working days with everything that you've requested. If you'd rather just use the Data Finder demo, this is where you would click on the same link, but you would actually use the page that pops up called the Data Finder. And again, this is a more user-friendly tool for people who are less comfortable working with full data sets. So say, for example, you want to use the Data Finder to find out what percentage of people in Bangladesh own a mobile phone and how has this figure changed since 2013. You would select country, category, and metric, and put that into the system, click the plus, and then you would get a graph that looks like this, and where you can play around with the demographics and the years on the right to see how that would change. So for instance, here you might see that from 2013 to 2015, the numbers of people in Bangladesh who owned a phone increased. If you're curious specifically about women, you would go to the view by demographic, update it to be about women, and once you click the gender variable, you would then see that actually for women, the number of percentages of phone ownership are much lower than for men. So that increase in phone ownership kind of hides a technology gap that's rising between women and men. Similarly, you may be wondering, are women in Pakistan using banks? You could type in country Pakistan category bank metric use. You would see that actually almost twice as many men are using banks in Pakistan as women. And overall, though, it's quite a small percentage of the population that are using formal banks. So that's just an example. And now I look forward to your Q&A.
Thank you so much for that, Nadia. Very, very rich presentation. I'll just add a few of my summary thoughts to what you're saying, and then we'll see if anything's coming in from the attendees. As you said, it's really about the client experience. I think demand data is so great because you can understand the barriers. You're surveying users and non-users of services, and our community of practice members constantly express interest on this, to me, interest in the barriers that people face. And I think the other big comparative advantage is that you compare women with men and compare women over time, as you pointed out. And you mentioned the fast changes in mobile money, which is why it's so great that this is annual. And I love your slide on Kenya, that the gaps, it's not linear, you know, the trend in gaps between men and women. It goes up, it goes down. You know, there are all sorts of factors that influence this. And you mentioned that you don't, in your definition of financial inclusion, you don't count informal, don't count people using others' accounts, and you don't count credit MFIs, but you still know the numbers in your data sets. You're just not aggregating them into the composite indicator where you say the proportion of adults that are financially included. But of course, users can find that information from your data. And I love that you track changes in dormancy rates over time, because this is another thing that members of our community of practice are very interested in, and it's a big critique on the outreach efforts of those in financial inclusion, in financial services, the high dormancy rates among women. And that also just wanted to point out how the different data points that you collect are relevant to you know, different users, as you pointed out. For example, the kinds of phones people have, that's naturally useful for providers, as is the dormancy rates. And the kinds of IDs that people have, that's quite useful for policymakers, as we can imagine, as they're developing Know Your Customer requirements and developing government policies. And finally, your empowerment module, which you pointed out, is really what makes FII so unique. And it's great that we can segment the financial inclusion outcomes for different groups of women and see how the various components of empowerment, whether it's decision-making, mobility, employment, how these interplay with access and use of financial inclusion. And as you point out, some of these may be endogenous, but I think that we have a number of academics who have tuned in, and I really hope that they'll join you at Intermedia in analyzing this more closely and parsing out some of the dynamics. And I hope that the practitioners who have tuned in, the implementers, can take this as a starting point for their for designing their diagnostics for program design. And so I'll just leave you with a quick question, actually building on that, about the analytical capacity of the users of the data, what you've found, what kinds of questions you've been getting from people, and what kind of internal analytics you do. You mentioned some of it here. Are there any plans for a gender report? I think that would be amazing, but if you could speak to that briefly, and we'll be monitoring the Q&A as you all send in your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for flagging all of those things. We absolutely do collect that information, even if it is outside of our reporting on the financial inclusion numbers. So I'm glad you mentioned that, especially given women's use of informal financial services and some of those other important barrier questions. So to get at your question around what are some of the kind of common data challenges that users have and the kinds of questions we get in requests for help, this is an ongoing challenge for us because while part of our mandate is to share as much data as possible, we don't necessarily have, frankly, budget to kind of help people use the data and figure it out. And people do have a lot of questions about such a big, large data set. One of the most common questions we get are sort of interpretations around the definitions and what does it really mean to own a mobile phone? How are you counting that? Which might seem basic, but can lead to further questions in terms of how the question is being asked, how it was implemented in the field, et cetera. Another very, very frequent request we get is for a merged data set. So one of the things you'll notice is if you request the data and you have more experience with data analysis, is that what we're sending you is a data set for each country for that year. So, 5 years, 8 countries, that's almost 40 data sets. But we don't have a merged data set outside of the key indicators, which are those 60 variables that ended up on the data finder. And this poses a challenge when users want to do some kind of basic analysis across countries, across years, as they are able to do with something like the Findex, which perhaps goes less in depth than FII in terms of the information that can be provided, but looks at cross-country comparisons and does collect information for every country and not just 8 countries. So that's one of the challenges we have. We don't have currently resources or staff time, frankly, for creating a large merged data set, and I know that that can make some researchers, the burden on them doing their own analysis with the data a bit more significant because they find themselves trying to merge the data themselves. So that's two common challenges we have. But otherwise, I think the biggest thing, again, is sort of guidance around how to interpret variables and what to do with them. And in terms of kind of looking ahead, what are our plans? We are coming up on 5 years of GATE support for the program, so we're not totally sure what the future will look like in terms of how many more waves, or we call them waves, years of the survey that it'll get produced. Will it be in fewer countries? Will it be in more countries? We hope so. We think it meets a huge data need, and based on what we see from users, we think a lot of people are using the data. But that does have implications for the gender module because, as I mentioned, we're really testing these 16 indicators for the first time, and we'll be running analysis on them. And to some extent, it's not a contest, but it's seeing which are the best variables and what tell people the most information. And it's likely that some will get cut, and some will get added, and some will get modified. So that's why this sort of test period is so important for us. So I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A, and one of the questions, it is actually another common question we get, is on the margin of error, so that we don't over-interpret small changes when we do see variations in data. And this is something we're very cognizant of, and that when you actually look at the annual reports, you see when we describe something as significant or insignificant. The margin of error for the Kenya data I showed is about 1 to 2%. So we're pretty confident in those gaps. That said, we understand that when you're collecting it from year to year, it's a bit harder to interpret a 2% increase than when you can look at 5 years and see those kinds of changes. What we're doing in the 2017 reporting is we're actually including error significant bars on all the charts. So when you go to download, our 2017 summary report, you would actually see what that margin of error could be. Another question I see is, it would be interesting to compare intra-household decision-making with countries' legal or regulatory frameworks provided by other data sets, and are we working with other demand-side providers? So to answer the first question, that would be super interesting, and to the extent that our empowerment indicators reflect things tied to the impact of maybe meso-level things such as community practices, community norms versus big legal regulatory frameworks, the ability of women to own assets, et cetera. That would be an interesting comparison, and I think we'll be diving more into it, especially to the extent that we can find funding to do some kind of gender report, but we don't currently do it at all. We always include some country context in our reporting and in our insights and analysis, but we haven't done a significant dive on this topic. The second question, are we working with other demand-side providers? So absolutely. We regularly meet with and talk with them, demand-side data providers. And we're working with them sort of on two fronts. One is an initiative that we call sort of harmonization. And so that's the idea that we do want our definitions to be similar and for the kinds of information we're collecting to be similar, to the extent that, you know, maybe we didn't do a big data collection in Morocco, but somebody else did, and people want to be able to compare some of the MENA level financial inclusion numbers with sub-Saharan Africa, but it's difficult with us because we only do 8 countries. But if our definitions for some of the key indicators are the same and they're being collected in the same way, it would be more comparable. So we're having discussions around that, and in fact, in the 2017 data, data collection, we included all the questions that are asked in the Findex so that we could certainly compare across our countries with those countries from years that they were collected previously. Similarly, we talk with them to the extent that it's around sort of survey methodologies, comparing notes, testing new modules on topics like financial health and others. So, for example, we're currently participating in the Gates Financial Health Working Group to get at sort of what are the best survey questions for measuring financial health across the world, and we plan to integrate lessons learned from those discussions into upcoming survey modules.
Great, and I hope everyone can hear me as I lean in very close and intimately to Nadia in order to get access to the mic. But actually, on that note, I was hoping you could go back through the empowerment slide, and so that, oh, you're here already. Sorry, I was monitoring the Q&A. Tell us a little bit more about some of these questions, perhaps some of the ones that you get most user questions about, and then if you could talk a little bit more about this financial health working group.
Sure. So we haven't really gotten questions about these empowerment indicators yet because we rolled them out for the first time over the last few months. Some of the kind of debates that we had were how to have the right number of indicators without overwhelming people. So for example, when we tested some of these in the field and we asked everybody participating in the survey, to what extent does your spouse or in-law make decisions for you, this was much funnier to some of the older women we talked to than some of the younger women. We also, you know, if you're asking this of a teenage girl who's unmarried, you need to skip over those questions with her. So we certainly have found in the testing that some of these need to be modified and that some of them were sort of redundant and lost survey respondent engagement to some extent. We are also curious, as we said, you know, which ones we'll find that get cut as we see they have less of impact in analysis. And we found, for example, that when it came to just general questions about household income decision making, we had much stronger effects than when we kept breaking it down around you versus somebody else, specifically in your family, or a basic need versus a final decision, et cetera. So we are curious to see how these play out, and often some of the feedback we got from gender experts on them and how to have the best questions, we then had to figure out how to ask them in a survey-friendly way that could be applied to everybody and lead to statistically significant results. So for example, it's one thing to say, do you speak your mind on a financial decision? But our experience was that we needed to create sort of a spectrum of how involved or uninvolved with several response options for users in order to really get at the heart of how they felt or experienced the issue. So sometimes the questions that had sort of more binary outcomes, we had to figure out a way to ask along a spectrum. And but my understanding is that these empowerment indicators are not collected in the Findex to this level of detail. So we'll be curious again to see how they test out and then maybe are integrated in other surveys or comparable across information collected in other demand-side surveys.
And these indicators will evolve for the next cycle, is that correct?
Yep, that's the idea.
And so you'll be able to do questions on, for example, are you given a budget, you know, and do you have full control over that budget, as is so often the case in intra-household decision making?
Yeah, so there are, so one of the things is I'm just showing the empowerment module here, but I'm not showing, for example, the financial health module. And in the financial health module, we do ask questions such as, do you budget ahead of time? Are you able to plan ahead of time, et cetera? I don't have it right in front of me, so I can't quite say how it compares to exact information around budget design. But all that to say that this is just one module on empowerment, and there are other modules that could be united or combined with this empowerment-specific module that would help advance greater understanding of women's financial lives. But then if there is specific interest in something like budgeting on a daily basis versus planning ahead, which are different, as Susan rightly flags, we could potentially update it based on user feedback and how it plays out. And then I also see a question on, do you have a question in the survey on asset ownership? There is a whole kind of labor market and economic status section. I don't think it really gets those questions really get at the heart of asset ownership, and that's another area that it could be improved. But there are sort of proxy looks at asset ownership. And again, part of this reflects that FII at its origins is very much a financial access and usage survey, and it's only recently that we're trying to introduce modules tied to empowerment and the economic lives of women. So there is kind of limited scope to add in questions, but the best ones would get added in, hopefully.
And I understand you also have some questions about time use, and do you have any on care responsibility? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So we do have some questions on time use to the extent that it relates to proximity to financial services and to place things like ATMs. And we actually changed the questions. That they used to be, how long does it take you to do something? And we found that people were struggling to estimate it, so we did change it to more of just a sheer distance question, which I know is controversial and some people have mixed opinions on. But otherwise, our time use questions, the other place that they come out are some of the questions around consumer experience. So what are some of the things, what might be some of the reasons you don't use a financial service, we ask, or like, what are some of the problems you've experienced? And there, some of the answers can be tied to time use, but we don't have a specific question at this point, or a specific set of questions on time use.
Great. And speaking of time, we're coming up on time ourselves, so I want to just ask two questions, and then I'll check again whether there are any additional audience questions. But a little bit about your processes and whether you follow the women's economic empowerment indicators that are being developed by many other organizations that are active in this space, and how that impacts both your indicator development and your analysis. And to that, you mentioned that you're currently doing analysis. Is there scope for our audience members to influence that in terms of the questions they would like answered and the kinds of analysis they would like to see, and how can they reach out to you on that?
Sure. So to answer the first question, currently, again, based on how the program was originally designed 5 years ago and the existing resources and team size, we haven't really been able to delve in to the world of gender analysis and economic indicators to the extent that we'd have liked to. And we've really benefited from the Gates gender team, who, Gates is at the end of the day the donor on this project, the extent to which they've been able to provide their expertise and sharing and thoughts. And they looped us in to the International Center for Research on Women, who gave us feedback on the survey and suggested, through a brainstorming sort of research exercise with us, the addition of these questions. So that's been one great value add, and it's quite recent. And that said, we are very interested in better understanding women's financial lives and financial health, and so we are eager to work with others to the extent that they're interested. But within our own current sort of program design and funding scope, our ability to engage is a little bit limited. And then in terms of how we would be eager to work with others and what others can do with the data, as I mentioned, please reach out, please download the data, please see what you can do with it, and please keep letting us know because that feedback is so important as we update the survey instrument each year. And again, it's so important as part of our mandate to be a public good and support the research of others. And while this is a financial inclusion data source, it's nothing if it's not also supporting things like the impacts of financial inclusion and the impacts they can have specifically on women's financial lives.
Great, and I think I'm hearing loud and clear the appetite for funder support. So if any of you out there listening, do get in touch. And I want to say thank you to Nadia for her insightful presentation on financial inclusion insights. And thank you to our audience for listening in and for your questions. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar and the slides as well. And I encourage all of you to sign up for the Women's Financial Inclusion Community of Practice. If you are not signed up already, we will send out a link in the follow-up to the webinar. And stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be in late January on gender insights from the FinScope surveys. So thank you once again, everyone, for participating.
Thank you.